It's a huge pleasure to introduce Nick Bryan-Kinns, our second keynote speaker. Nick Bryan-Kinns is a professor of creative computing at the University of the Arts London. He's a Turing Fellow. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, distinguished professor at Henan University in China, having developed a range of UK-China partnerships. He's had pieces and exhibitions at the V&A Museum and the Science Museum in London. He has a £24 million research funding portfolio, which includes a track record of highly socially positive research. Supervised over 21 PhD students to completion, including several stars in their own right, with another 9 or so in the pipeline. His research has spanned remote group improvisation, performative tangible interaction, extended reality, audience participation, and he has a current focus on human-centered AI and explainable AI for the arts. So without more ado, let me hand you over to Nick Bryan-Kinns.
Okay, well, thanks for that intro, Simon. Very nice. Oh, it's a bit heavy to follow that. So yeah, I'm Nick Bryan-Kinns. Thanks for inviting me to talk today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research we've been doing recently, me and my researchers, PhD students, and so on. And first, I will just briefly introduce you to University of the Arts London. So I'm a professor of creative computing at the University of the Arts London. If you don't know University of the Arts London, it is number 2 in the world for art and design. Yes. And it has many colleges, such as London College of Fashion, Central St Martin's, London College of Communication, this kind of thing. And my favourite thing is Grayson Perry, who was the Chancellor of the University of the Arts London, described it as the world's biggest factory for making trouble. So, frankly, you know, our mission is to go out and break things and do things that will challenge discourses in the world and think about how we can do things differently. So I'm in the Creative Computing Institute, if you haven't heard of that. It's an institute within the University of the Arts London with people, professors such as myself, Mick Grierson, Rebecca Feebrink, and so on. And we've got a strong social mission, but we focus a lot on creativity, AI, and big data and robotics, which we'll talk about today. So I'm going to briefly touch on some bit of background about human-centered AI and music, and then talk about some of the challenges that I think there are in thinking about music making with AI in more human-centered ways, and think about some design methods, and then a quick wrap up. So yeah, like Simon said, my background is it sort of comes from human-computer interaction, I suppose, for 20 years or more. And I'm really interested in how people interact with AI in creative settings. So I looked back at my papers, and I found the first paper that I'd written on AI and music was back in 2008 with Andrew Robertson. And he was writing a paper in his PhD about AI drummers, or beat tracking at that time. And we were very interested to see whether drummers could tell the difference between a beat tracking drummer and somebody playing drums themselves, or just a straight metronome drummer. So I've been looking at AI in the creative settings for quite a while. And first I wanted to think about a tautology. I had to look this word up. It's a great word. It means saying the same thing in 2 different ways, as far as I understood it. So human-centered AI and music is the title of this talk, right? And I was thinking, oh, what should I call the talk? And I was like, oh, human-centered AI and music, that sounds great. But there was something that really bothered me about this title, and I feel that this title in itself has a tautology in it, so I learned a new word. So somehow, human-centered seems to be a tautology with music, right? I mean, how can music not be human-centered? What is unhuman-centered music? Any thoughts? No. So I was struggling with this. I was thinking, why have I called my talk human-centered music? Because music's always human-centered. That was confusing. And then I also thought there was a contradiction in this talk as well, because AI and music, I find that an awkward thing. I don't know if AI can really make music. I don't think it does, really, frankly. So I made this title for the talk, and I spent a long time being troubled by it. And then I thought, you know, if something's complicated and I don't really understand it, best thing is to put it in a slide and a talk, and that will help me think it through. So this title, really, I thought a lot about this, thinking, yeah, music is really human-centered. And then it took me back to this paper that we had before where I tried to capture this, where I was thinking, music is made and appreciated by humans, or people, let's say, and can be generated by AI. So I really personally do not think that AI generates music. I think that AI generates sound, and we might appreciate it as music. But to make music, making music is an act that we do as human beings in the world. So maybe I'll stop there and see if anybody has any other thoughts about that. Anybody think that AI does generate music? Or would like to argue for that? No. Yes.
I have a thought.
Yes.
So a chord, a guitar chord,
Yes.
generated by human being
Yeah.
and AI might sound like it.
Sounds identical, yeah?
What's the difference?
What do you think the difference is?
I wouldn't be able to tell. I just listen to talk about
Yeah.
AI because what AI is generating is something that has been created by a human being before.
Yeah.
It's reproducing it, right?
Yeah.
It's playing it back in a sense. However, I would be very skeptical listening to a song, a brilliant song, and knowing that who wrote the song, and then knowing that it's AI generated.
Yeah.
It would make me question whether this is composed, the verb really matters, or generated, as you mentioned.
Yeah, so I think there, if it was two identical chords, they both are generated, right? One is generated by a computer, one is generated by a person. Possibly the one generated by a person is music, right? Maybe they made it with some context or feeling or emotion into that thing. Even if I just play an A chord, it's not just an A chord, it's a chord I played. I'm already playing it on a guitar. That's already, I'm already identifying myself as a guitar player just by doing that, right? So even just a single chord, I think, has intention behind it, right? And that's what makes the music. That's what it means to make music, is to have some intention, even if it's unconscious. You are, in some way, bringing all your cultural context and biases, as was talked about earlier, to that piece of just that single chord, or the single note, even. And so I think, like some of Andrew McPherson's work, where he just looks at single notes or single key instruments and that kind of stuff, you know, you could argue, well, that's just a beep. A computer just makes a beep as well. But the way that you use that single button has intention, has human values behind it. And that's what I think is the difference between generating audio and making music. Which is why I think that my title has so many contradictions in it.
That's an interesting point. Sorry, music's more complex, but if you think about poetry, I mean, they've
Yep.
been generating poetry for a long time using automated poetry models. And it's quite debatable about whether those, I mean, putting aside profit and the stuff I hate about it, do you know what I mean? But, even back to Cage, right? When he was trying to remove the performance intention in some sense. I mean, it's debatable, but I just wondered, would you say the poetry thing? I don't know, it's a fine line.
Well, I would think it's the same sort of thing, right? So you could have, again, you could have a set of words that are generated by a computer and a set of words that are generated by a person. But surely to, again, make poetry is to draw on all your lived experience to create that set of words, which is different to randomly putting together a set of words that happen to be more likely to follow each other from a giant pool of words that you've scraped the whole internet for.
But Cage was doing that, right? He would generate.
John Cage?
John Cage, and then
Yeah.
he would perform them, right?
But him as the composer, the intention there is in the composer, right? The composer composes that piece with the intention of, in his case, potentially confounding the audience or confounding the artist, maybe, or at least pushing against the boundaries of what it makes to make music. I don't believe that AI systems sit there and think, well, they don't think. I don't believe they have the intention to push boundaries of what it means to make music. Simon, do I need to stop?
I'm a bit worried about intention. I know a 4-year-old who makes music. I don't think she's particularly intending anything. She makes
Yeah.
music.
Okay, I'm going to take that. I'm going to think I shall return to the questions at the end, maybe. Otherwise, I mean, it's great because then I don't need to do the other slides. But shall we carry on? Okay. All right. So we'll return to this at the end. But yes, I really spent an unusually large amount of time thinking about this one sentence for the title. But it's been stuff that's been sort of playing on my mind since I think we got the AI and Music CDT at Queen Mary, and I've been thinking a lot about what does that even mean, right? So, yeah. let's return to that later. So a little bit of history. I think we're going to skip over the history. So I was just going to talk about the free ways of HCI, of AI, but also the main thing that I'm concerned about is these ever-increasing AI model complexity, which I think Tina talked about earlier as well, like the large language models and how they're so difficult to understand. So the main thing that I'm interested in terms of AI and music making is it's super hard to understand how AI model works, right? And why it made the decisions, or where it did, or where the training data came from. So we had this paper in 2023, which Courtney was part of, where we reviewed 100 papers from NIME, talking about AI and music making generation, to look at how explainable the different models were. And you don't need to know what this graph indicates, but it basically shows that hardly any of them gave any explanation of what the models were, and hardly any of them allowed any control of that AI model. So even though we've had these three waves of AI from the 1950s until now, we're still left with this thing where we've got this mysterious, opaque thing that we don't know how to control. So my vision really for human-centered AI and music is really, I really want to find ways to use AI that's empowering creativity, people's creativity, that is explainable, that can be meaningfully controlled, and that is responsible and ethical. So again, I think a few of those things came up this morning in this morning's talks, especially around being responsible. So think about bias and cultural settings, cultural context, and also control. How do you control these AI systems? So that's my broad vision for what I am interested in researching. And then the more words that are super complicated and awkward are human-centered AI, responsible AI, and explainable AI. So I do a lot of writing in this area, and these words all get mixed up and they get conflated. So the way I see it, right, is human-centered AI is sort of big, grand challenges like being well-being and respects human cognitive processes. Responsible AI is more about explainability and fairness and so on. And then explainability, or an explainable AI, which is where I sort of started looking at AI and music maybe 3 or 4 years ago, is a really pragmatic, how can I actually do something? How do I know what the model's doing? How do I define the interface and so on? So the way these fit together, in my mind anyway, is this human-centered AI is like the big picture, like the grand challenges. The responsible AI seems to be more policy, so it's stuff that you might talk to a government or companies about. And then the implementation, how you actually do it, tends to be things like explainable AI or trustful AI or these kind of things. And the main problem I worked a lot with explainable AI, and the main problem I found with that is that there's lots of different understandings of what explainability is. So if you talk to a machine learning engineer, it'll be a different understanding of what explainability is to somebody who is a creative practitioner. So, big challenges, right? We've got these big AI models, and they're changing our design workflows, or our creative workflows, let's call them. So what I tend to find is that the generative AI stuff is good in these sort of divergent thinking contexts, like designing and developing, not so good in these focused activities. And what's happening then is we get this shift in creative effort. So I'm sure people will have noticed this when you try and use AI systems. You tend to shift from the interesting exploration phases, tend to be focused more on generative AI, and now the human is in evaluating. So instead of the human doing most of the innovation, people are now spending more of their time evaluating outputs from generative AI systems. So the use of these deep learning models is changing the way that we are creating. And why is that? I think it's because there's a lack of transparency, a lack of control. We get these biased generative AI models that was talked about this morning, and a lack of creative attribution. So these are the sort of challenges that lead to that shift, where we're moving from being innovators and creative people to becoming more just evaluating the generative outputs. So my research is really about how can we design solutions that address that. So how do we make AI systems that are more controllable, more transparent, more explainable? So we had this paper back in 2020, I think, or 21, where we looked at how to make a measure VAE, so variation autoencoder. I won't explain how it works because I think most people here would know. But we basically tried to visualize 4 of the dimensions of a regularized variational autoencoder. So we would visualize them in terms of meaningful metrics, so looking at like the rhythmic density or the note variation, that kind of stuff, and then allowing people to navigate around in that space. And then look at how that could be actually deployed in different generative AI systems to actually make them more controllable, more transparent, more intuitive for people to use. And then also, as was mentioned earlier, so we then use these same sort of techniques to think about how might we use that in visual design. So think about generative AI in visual systems. And I've got a project at the moment with the BBC looking at how we can actually make generative AI more explainable within the BBC context. So that's about control and transparency and understanding what's happening in the model and trying to visualize the insides of those models. The other piece of work that I'm interested in is the bias in AI models, which was talked about a couple of times this morning. So I won't go over it too much just for time, but you know, if you've got something like stable audio, it's very good at making sort of nice, like this. Oh, it's good at that. Yeah. So it's great at that kind of music. And then when I was in China working with some of the Chinese partners, and we were doing some ideation workshops, and we were trying to make some advertising slogans and the idea was, oh, we're going to make this advert for a local food place, and so it was a spicy Sichuan food restaurant, and we were like, okay, let's generate some audio, that's going to be cool. So we did, this is the prompt, music for advert for spicy Sichuan food restaurant. So, and this is what it came up with. And I thought, maybe my prompt isn't super good. Maybe I need to, you know, maybe it's actually trying to recreate the sound of a spicy food restaurant or something. You know, I don't know what's wrong there. So I tried to re-engineer the prompt, and the nearest I got to something that sounded sort of musical was this one. Ooh. Yeah. So it almost gets there, right? But then it sort of descends into Irish folk, and then there's some other weird thing happening there. So I found this interesting example because it's sort of the same thing that was talked about this morning. Basically, it's trained on so much trance or rock or pop or whatever that it must have a super small amount of traditional Chinese music trained in it. Because I didn't even say like a certain genre of Chinese music. I just said Chinese style, right? So I gave it a nice broad option, and it still made this really, really terrible thing. And this is like, I think this year that I did this, right? So it's not like I'm using an old model or something. So my concern is, with these kind of models, this is really biasing the kind of output that we're going to generate, right? So, okay, it's great if you're in West Coast America and you want to make some trance music, great. If you're somewhere else in the world and you have something else you want to do, it's just not going to work. And it's going to make you tend towards saying, okay, so for my advert for my spicy Sichuan food restaurant, I think I'll just use some trance music because I can't get the Chinese stuff to work. So my concern is this is really changing the way people are working. So that's a simple example. And then we had this paper with Bernard, who people might know, where we actually went and we trained some generative models. I think this one was the Measure VAE, yeah. So we trained it with 4 different training sets to see the different reconstruction performance. And we found, of course, that the generative AI was biased towards Western music styles. And you're like, okay, I understand that because it's been fine-tuned, right? So every time they've made a new version of the Measure VAE, they want to improve the performance of that model. And to improve the performance of the model, they enter competitions, and the competitions are all based on Western music sets. So they're always getting trained towards this Western style. So for example, in this one, the Irish folk performed pretty well, not surprising, but the Turkish folk music performed really badly. And this is because the different rhythms and also the different tunings that were used. I will skip over that one. And then we even compared 2 different kinds of variational autoencoders and found that the two autoencoders were good for different kinds of music because, again, they'd been optimized using different training sets. So it's not just that one AI model is biased towards these large, let's call them Western data sets. All of them seem to be biased and in different ways. So if you're trying to find something that could generate Turkish folk music, you might be better off using this one on the left. I think it was the adversarial one. Seemed to work a little bit better than the one on the right. So I'm just looking at the time, yeah. So I'm very interested in that problem of bias, and it happens in all sorts of things. So we were looking at visual generative AI as well, so again, working with the partners in China. They wanted to have a generative system that could generate new designs of this Huaiyou cross-stitch, and this is a minority culture in southwest China, and they do these designs, brocade designs. So they built a training set, and they thought, oh, you know what? We're going to fine-tune stable diffusion, because we heard you can get stable diffusion, you can fine-tune it to your own images, right? And then it will generate your images. So they built this training set from all the local brocade patterns. They train up their stable diffusion model, and it generates stuff that is not Huaiyou cross-stitch. It generates stuff that looks kind of like Japanese dragons. So these dragons and phoenixes are really not the kind of dragons and phoenixes that you would see in Huaiyou cross-stitch. And what's interesting about them is, again, it's just the dominance of probably Japanese training data in the model. Even though we fine-tuned it with this one, still outweighs the fine-tuning that we've done. And then finally, I had a student who's just finished their master's project. They did quite an interesting thing where they looked at this different kinds of words that different languages use, whether they're more secular or less secular, or whether they're about survival versus self-expression, so the kinds of themes. And what's super interesting is that GPT is all the way over here, right? So for some reason, ChatGPT tries to be as self-expressive as possible, even though it's a machine. Like, why does it do that? Like, if you look at the United States, the style of language, let's say, that is used in the United States is not even in the area that GPT is using. It's weird. We're just about in there. So you get these weird biases where ChatGPT is really out there, really in this sort of, thinks of itself as a progressive kind of speaker, and yet all the other languages are way further away. So what are the solutions here? Well, for this one, I've been looking at how you can co-create data sets, so smaller data sets and more fine-grained control. So working with a company called Darcy, which is an SME that produces AI generative tools, and we wanted to find out how could we expand these tools to make them work with different kinds of musical genres, not just the Western genre being trained on. So we added a lot of different features to allow the generation to be beyond the conventional sort of Western style. And what I found as a musician was I went from like being a sort of I like that. Oh, that's nice. I'm a bassist, right? So this is great. Oh, I can just play this all along. So I went from that, and when I was playing with their tool and we'd expanded it to different genres, I found myself doing this kind of stuff. Oh, yeah, it's different, right? And I was like, somehow I like it. And I was finding that it was actually pushing me in a different direction than I'd been before as a musician. So as well as opening it up to different styles, I'm not saying I'm going to be an amazing tabla player or something like that, but the point is it's changed the way that I actually thought about making music, or making drums anyway. So we've been doing work on that, and then another thing we've been trying to do is build international workshops to challenge dominant discourses around AI. So think about how can we make these networks of people come together, or how can we bring networks of people together to address these challenges? So first one we had is the Explainable AI in the Arts network, which started a couple of years ago. And we were interested there as a AI, arts as a way to explore explainable AI. And we are developing a manifesto, which we will certainly soon publish. So thinking really about fostering creative agency in generative AI, thinking about regaining trust in AI for creative practitioners, equality, diversity, and inclusion in AI creations, and so on. And the second sort of network that I've been building is this Responsible AI International Research Project, bringing together these countries, UK, China, Philippines, Sweden, Estonia, USA, Canada, Germany, to think about how we can make accessible different AI models for generating music with different genres that are not in a sort of Western dominant style. So in that we had things like interviews with many famous people, Mick Grierson, Andrew McPherson, these kind of folks, and workshops in China and the UK, and compositions, And what we're doing now is building an ecosystem. So if you're interested in getting involved with this ecosystem, we're going to be building some sort of online ecosystem where people can share small music data sets, but more importantly, where we will make available or point to low-resource AI architectures, models, and settings that could be used with these data sets to generate music, as well as how-to guides and talking about style transfer and that kind of stuff. And we just commissioned 3 artists to create some pieces of music using these kind of data sets. So I would be really interested if people want to get involved with that network to bring together different kinds of music making. And we're especially interested in finding out about kinds of AI models that could be used to generate music that are not the big deep learning ones, but are small ones that could work for certain kinds of music or certain features of music. So that's the networks we're building. And then finally, I'll just talk about a couple of methods that I've been working on that I think are kind of fun. I've got enough time to go into one of them in detail. So there's a fun project that we looked at about what I call an incongruous design strategy. So really, I was interested in what happens when we use AI outside its intended use cases. So how do creative practices change in response to AI if we're pushing it in that way? How is AI misappropriated? And what would be a playful approach to exploring the boundaries of generative AI? So in this system, we have this AI music VAE system that Berker created a couple of years ago. It's trained on Irish folk music. So you input a little bit of Irish folk and it'll give you a variation. So it does it in real time, which is cool. Oh, can't stand that. So we input that and we get this. Pretty. So we get variations. So that's nice. Well, what I was interested in was what happens if we give it to some of our PhD students who are not Irish folk musicians and they make a totally different kind of music. What do they do with it? So I gave it to a band which includes Corey Ford, who just passed his PhD viva. Yes! And his music came out like this. So it's quite different to Irish folk, but kind of similar, right? It's sort of similar. And then I asked Ash, who's another one of my PhD students, to give it a go and see what he does. And Ash is an algorithmic music composer, and his was like this. Yeah. So that's quite different to Irish folk music. And you might say, why are you doing this? So the reason I do this is it's really a good way to reveal design opportunities, to try and push the AI model outside its comfort zone, let's say, into unusual spaces. And in doing this, we identified a number of interesting design opportunities, let's say. So, for example, because it was producing so much stuff that they didn't like, it was essentially torrential AI. So they were just getting all this outputs that didn't fit their musical style, right? So they were like, oh my God, there's so much stuff and I don't like it. What do I do? How do I navigate that space? So actually by doing this incongruous approach, you can essentially stress test your user interface. You can say, okay, let's see what happens if people are really having to work hard to find the outputs they like. I found it super interesting that when they talked about the AI system, they were saying they had to make offerings to the AI, or they had to feed it, or they had to sacrifice one of our instruments. It was very sort of weirdly, almost religious kind of thing going on here. So this sort of incongruous approach, again, pushes people to talk about things maybe a little bit more subjectively, just saying, rather than saying, oh, it was good or bad, or oh, I rate it at 95%, they started to think a little bit more reflectively about what was happening. And so that allows us to really think maybe more about prompting and provoking discussions around this kind of AI technology. It, of course, revealed questions about trust and the anxiety of using AI. So what happens to the content when I put it in there? How come every time I put something nice in there, it comes out sounding like an Irish folk tune? I don't like it. These kind of things. But interesting, the glitch musician, Ash, talked about spending time creating a mental model of how the system worked. So using this incongruous approach, you can actually start to push people to try and understand how they think it's working. Because it's working outside their usual music-making norms, it actually makes them think about the process more. And then finally, They had to really scaffold around the output that it made because it really didn't fit with their style. They had to be creating additional stuff to produce the music. So it wasn't just the outputs, they were having to sketch and keep notes and so on. So again, this incongruous approach really helps you to highlight elements that might be missing in your interfaces. So for me, the value of doing this incongruous approach is really, it exaggerates the frictions that occur between people and the AI, people and the generative AI systems. So you can really work on those frictions, you can really explore those in depth using this approach. And that's what I think is valuable about taking this sort of weird, bizarre approach. So, shout out to Corey. He's got a nice questionnaire on reflection, which he's been using with AI. So maybe not just think about, is the AI more efficient or whatever, but does it make me reflect whilst I'm making music? So Corey's got a paper on that. Have a look at that. So just to sum up, so there is these challenges to the creative process that generative AI brings, so the lack of transparency, the lack of control, the biased generative AI models, and the lack of creative attribution. And I talked through some of the things that we've been trying to do to address that and some of the things that my team have been doing. And I just wanted to finish up with some design tensions, which also were talked about this morning. So the problem that I found with trying to think about explainable AI and human-centered AI and so on is that you have this tension between, oh, I want to make a transparent AI model that's easy for me to see inside, but I also want to be surprised at the same time. So how do you balance the tension between transparency and surprise in these interactions? How do we balance between meaningful control? And by that I mean, I want to be able to control things in the interface, not just, oh, I changed the seed value between 0 and 0.5. I want to be able to change meaningful properties of the AI model. How do I balance between meaningful control and just feeling like I'm influencing the AI and it's actually got some of its own activity? How do I balance between mitigating bias, like making sure that the data sets or the models I'm using are not biased, but also be able to curate my own data sets, because curating my own data sets is essentially a bias, right? I'm creating a bias. I say, this is my music, I want the AI to be like this. So how do we make that balance? And finally, how do we balance between explanation and intuition? So you can't have it that the AI model is explaining everything it's doing all the time. When you jam with other people in a music setting, in a gig, they're not just shouting, oh, I'm going to play an A because, oh, I played an A last week. You know, you need some balance between explanation and intuition. So for me, this is a sort of design space that I'm interested in exploring. At the moment, I think mostly the things I've seen are in this sort of gray area, right? There's a little bit of surprise because actually you don't know what the model's doing. Mostly people try these days, especially people here in this crowd, I think, would be trying to curate your own data sets, make your own models and so on. But really there needs to be more, I think, more focus on expanding this, so making things more meaningful control, but also more surprising, having more explanation, but also more intuition, trying to mitigate the bias and being able to have my own curated data sets in there. So for me, that's really the vision, right? Expanding this so that we have these balances between these different design tensions. And for me, I think that would really be empowering for creativity. It would make the interfaces more explainable and more meaningfully controlled, and it would be responsible and ethical uses of AI. Okay, thank you very much. Now we have questions, or we can go back to the first question.
Hi, thank you so much for this. This was awesome. I feel like I have the whole entire talk, like taking pictures of the slides, because everyone was fantastic. I have kind of a not very high-minded question, somewhat of a boring question, but I would be really interested in hearing how you navigate the complexities of public-private partnerships, particularly that network slide, and like how do you negotiate things like IP and commercialization and balance profit-driven motives versus academic research?
That is difficult, yeah. So in those projects, so I got one project with the BBC. As you would notice, there was no information about that. So the way it's negotiated, it's totally an NDA and I can't talk about it. So there's no negotiation. And then there was a project there with Darcy, which is a startup company that produces Gen AI plugins. And that's more open. And the difficulty of balancing there is they are on different timescales. I'm an academic. I work quite quickly as an academic, relatively, I feel. But they were working on a very crazy timescale. And they always have these things that come up like, oh, yeah. We were going to do a user study next week, but we suddenly decided to launch a new version of the thing. So can we do the user study tomorrow? And it's like, oh, no, we can't do that. So how do we manage that? I think we manage it mostly by trying to be open between these people and also setting clear, I guess, boundaries of what we're doing. With the final, the international network, it was difficult. It's been difficult managing the partners on that, not just commercial, but academic as well, because it turns out there's different expectations, I don't know how to say this politely, different expectations in different countries about what a collaboration agreement would be. So we found it very hard to sign collaboration agreement with North American countries, right? Because they would say, oh, your network is 1 year long. It's going to take us more than a year to get this through our internal review process. Therefore, there's no point in us saying, I'm like, a year? I mean, we're not even giving them money, right? There's no financial thing. It's just a network. So that was hard. And so you have to be, in that case, flexible with how you think about what a partnership means. It doesn't mean necessarily signing the collaboration agreement, but it means, yeah, come to the events, contribute things, be an academic in that sense. So that was super difficult. And then in terms of the commercial partners on that one, it's actually been quite nice because for the artistic commissions, we said, let us know if there's partners you want to connect with. We've actually been able to connect some of the commercial partners to the artists to use their secret tools in the music making thing. So it's quite cool. But to answer your question, it's difficult, and I find it very problematic, and it takes a long time and much longer. So the BBC, for example, I don't think it's confidential, it took 4 months to sign the collaboration agreement between our university and the BBC. And that's crazy, right? Because they both want to do it, and it's like, wow. Yeah, anyway. Yeah.
Wow, very loud. I just got a reflection. I felt an awful lot of hope towards the end of your talk.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if this is what you were going for, but the outcome of your drum machine and your experiments with the misuse of AI made me reflect on the misuse of technology in the past to create very interesting new musics.
Yeah.
And I suddenly just found myself thinking about a lot of me, but I think other people are sat here thinking, this is the tool, this is how it's going to be used, and obviously this is what's going to happen. And I think it's the first time I've really strongly felt, actually, we could end up with tools that we think are for this and actually end up being used over here. And there's a new, not yet imagined creative output that is very much human-centric, where we pick up tools that were intended for something else or have been discarded, and whole new genres or ways of communication or being. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, no, I think that'd be great. And I think... I don't know, maybe it comes from I spent a lot of time doing hacking and stuff in the 2000s and misappropriating technology and doing weird stuff with technology. And so maybe it comes from that a bit. But I think it also comes as a reaction against this growing hegemony. I think that's a word, right? I keep on having to look these words up in a dictionary. The growing consolidation of all these deep learning things in 4 big companies. And I just find that really problematic. And really troubling in terms of how we push ourselves forward in terms of using technology, but also how we retain control of our data, our creative self. So I think a lot of this pushing around the edges is trying to find interesting and fun ways to explore technology that is not in that sort of big 4 AI model thing. Yeah. And I'm glad it sounds positive. I mean, I feel very positive about it, and I don't know, I think because there's more, now that our laptops are getting more powerful, we can actually run a lot of the models just on the laptop, right? We don't need to go and put it in the cloud and whatever. If we use a smaller model and we actually know what we're doing, you can actually get this stuff running on the laptop, quite interesting models to run. And so I think that sense of control, I can run it on a laptop. I don't need to give my data to Facebook or Meta or whatever it is to get the models to run. I think, yeah, that's what I'm interested in.
As someone who's spent some time working in the AI music industry, but also has spent a lot of time in front of a DAW making music, for a technology that we really care to be human-centric, because what else is music, as you said, it seems to me like there's a disproportionate focus on the black box model of audio comes in, audio comes out. And that's not how humans think of making music at all. We think of instruments, and we think of structures, and we think of these higher level symbolic sort of features that we potentially project onto a two-dimensional audio signal. But isn't this approach of trying to train these massive scale models over years or decades or centuries worth of GPU time on signals that have been very poorly annotated, instead of just starting from the ground up and maybe giving some DAW control to the models and having them pick presets and having them pick the tempo and so on? Isn't that kind of like trying to learn how to run before we learn how to walk?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's not so much learning to run. I feel like we did learn how to run. Like, and a lot of the models from 5, 10 years or 15 years ago, they would be great. So we sort of learned how to run, and then we started driving cars, and somebody else made the car or something. I don't know what the analogy would be. So I think a lot of these things we could go back to, like a lot of the models that were not the big deep learning ones, but some of the earlier ones. And they are much more straightforward to understand, right? You can actually figure out what they're doing and how they're working. And as I said, now you can run them on the laptop. Some of them even you would be able to do real-time stuff with them. So yeah, I think the emphasis on moving away from the really big deep learning models and having more specialized things that actually are part of our, let's say, our creative tool set, our creative palette, like our instruments, essentially. I think that would be a great direction. And I think a lot of people in this room are sort of going that direction. Like when I look at the talks and so on, it seems like this sort of community of people that know technology and music and interaction very much focus on that more personal kind of tool. And I used to think that creating individual, personal tools and models in computing was not a productive way to go. I thought, oh, you should make models that are applicable to everybody can use them, blah, blah, blah. But I actually think for creative practice, making a tool that you use in creative practice is a very personal thing. And so it ends up being a very personal tool that maybe only you can use, which is fine if that's what you want to use for making music, right? So I kind of moved away from that idea of thinking you could have one creative tool that everybody would be able to create drums with or something, and think more now of like, like you say, like an instrument, like you make a specific thing that fits your genre, your context, your lived experience. Yeah.
Thanks. I think we'll have to stop at that point, but that's a shame because obviously this discussion is rich and interesting. But yeah, thanks again, Nick Bryan-Kinns.
Thank you.